Let's start it.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our Department of Medicine academic fees that we have which has been ongoing for last 8 months. Now we have started with our gastrohepat series of lectures from since yesterday. This will go on for the next 4 weeks on every Fridays and Saturdays. Fridays we'll have hepat lectures followed by gastro lectures on Saturday. So today we have Dr. Amit Kumar Dutta. Sir is a professor in the Gastroenterology department of CMC Vellore. Sir has more than 73 publications and he also authored more than 6 book chapters. He's also editorial board member for Indian Journal of Gastro and World Journal of Gastro and GHCP. Sir's research area is in the luminal GI disorders, advanced endoscopic imaging, and he also have a major research grant as an DST grant to gut microbiota and Crohn's disease. He has also been awarded multiple awards. To name some, will be the Shandla Mirchand Prize ICMR Award, Indian Society of Gastroenterology Om Prakash Memorial Award, and Japanese Society of Gastroenterology Research Program Award. So is also a member of Indian Society of Gastroenterology Task Forces on dyspepsia, GRD, and H. pylori. So as I mentioned, today for the gastro topic per se, we have Sir taking lecture on approach to malabsorption, something which we all have been, as a medicine, the medicine PGs will be seeing on a day-to-day basis, OPD basis, and also on an IP patient. This will be, hopefully, this is going to give you a very clear overview on how to approach malabsorption and for any audience otherwise who has joined in. If any doubts, please feel free to ask questions, unmute yourself, otherwise put down in the chat box. This lecture will soon be uploaded in our Department of Medicine YouTube website for those who have missed out on lecture. So again, we are very thankful to have you again in our platform. We are grateful that you have agreed to take this lecture for us. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anju. And I'd like to thank the Department of Medicine for inviting me for this lecture. I'll just start sharing my screen. So is my slide visible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So as Dr. Anju has mentioned that the topic for today's lecture is approach to malabsorption. Okay. So I'll start with a case scenario. So basically, this is a 38-year-old patient who's come to us with history of large volume diarrhea for 6 months. Okay. And the patient has also lost about 10 kilograms of weight. Patient is having swelling of both the legs for 1 month. Patient feels fatigued and tired. There's no history of any comorbid illness, any drug intake, or any abdominal surgery. An examination shows that the patient has pallor. There is bilateral pitting pedal edema. Patient also has wasting of forearm muscles. And there's loss of fat in form of loss of buccal pad of fat. So abdominal examination is unremarkable. So this is essentially a patient who's got chronic diarrhea because diarrhea is for more than 6 months. It's a large volume, so probably it's a small bowel diarrhea. And along with diarrhea, patient also has significant weight loss. There are features of nutritional anemia. There is low albumin. Patient has pedal edema. There's loss of muscle mass, and also there's loss of fat. So this is the classical presentation of a patient who has malabsorption syndrome. But remember that every patient does not have classical presentation. There is a spectrum from the less severe to the more severe typical form. And in today's lecture, hello, yeah.
No, ma'am. So nothing.
Yeah,
We'll mute them.
some background noise, yeah.
Sorry
Okay.
about that.
So in today's lecture, we are going to discuss that if we see such a patient in our clinic or in the ward, how are you going to approach this patient in terms of diagnosing malabsorption and how to go about the different conditions, and that will help us in deciding how we treat those patients. Okay. So when we say malabsorption, actually the term malabsorption is quite broad. It includes both abnormality in absorption as well as abnormality in digestion. So there can be maldigestion or defect in absorption. All of them are clubbed together under the one heading, malabsorption. Okay, and there are a number of conditions which can lead to malabsorption, but because it is treatable in most circumstances, it's important that we should suspect this patient may be having malabsorption, and we should adequately evaluate the patient. Okay, so before I discuss the etiologies or what are the different causes, it's good to know briefly about the physiology of digestion and absorption. Now, digestion and absorption is a complex process. It requires input from different part of the GI tract. The most important is small intestine. Then there are contributions from stomach, contributions from pancreas and liver. So essentially, the first step is digestion and next is absorption. So in digestion, of enzymes and all these contributions from different areas, the food is broken down into smaller, simpler particles. Okay, and this happens not only in the lumen, but it also happens on the mucosal brush border of the small intestine. In fact, there are some enzymes which are also intracellular. So digestion happens in the lumen, on the surface of mucosa, as well as intracellular part as well. Okay, and once the nutrients are digested and converted into smaller molecules, simpler molecules, then they need to be absorbed. For absorption, you need to have a healthy mucosal surface, okay, an adequate amount of good surface area, and the surface area has to be. So that's the requirement for absorption. And once the food is absorbed, it either enters the venous system or the lymphatics. Okay. Now, along with all this, the motility also is important. It's very important to have a normal motility for the process of digestion and absorption to move smoothly. If there is disturbed motility, then this process also will get disturbed. So again, just to summarize, the process of digestion and absorption is complex, requires inputs from various structure, most important being small intestine, but also from stomach, pancreas, and liver. And after digestion, food is absorbed, it enters into the venous and lymphatic system. And you also need to have a good motility for the digestion to proceed smoothly. So because so many factors are contributing to the process of digestion and absorption, it's not surprising that the number of conditions which cause malabsorption is quite big. Okay, and here I have divided them into the different area wise. As I told you, small intestine is the most important place for process of digestion and absorption. So most of the disorders are actually from the small intestine. Okay, then you have disorders of pancreas, problems in stomach or even liver, which leads to malabsorption. Now, while the list is very big, if you can remember these four conditions which are marked in red, that is celiac disease, tropical sprue, Crohn's disease, which is inflammatory bowel disease, and infection, which includes TB, HIV-related parasites, Giardia stromatolides. So if you remember these four conditions, you will be able to diagnose about 80% of your cases. So while there are many conditions causing malabsorption, the important ones are celiac disease, tropical sprue, Crohn's disease, and infections, most of which are disease of the, all of them are disease of small intestine. Okay. Now, in addition to these conditions, you can also have a short bowel syndrome where the bowel length is reduced because of surgery. There is not adequate amount of surface area for digestion or absorption. Sometimes there may be a stasis of the bowel content and the patient may have overgrowth of bacteria. Then there may be damage to the GI tract, radiation, immunodeficiencies may predispose to infections. Other conditions like eosinophilic gastroenteritis, lymphoma, IPSID. IPSID is something which used to be seen in the past, but we have not seen any case for the last 10 to 15 years. But this is something which was earlier a cause of malabsorption. You have lymphangiectasia, bariatric surgery. Now, bariatric surgery, actually, the aim of surgery is to induce malabsorption. So, malabsorption is not a disease, but obviously they get malabsorption because that's what the aim of surgery is, to reduce absorption so that the patient loses weight. Connective tissue disorders, again, the important ones being scleroderma and SLE. These are the two main conditions where you can have malabsorption, patients with fistulas, stomas, and drugs. Okay, so this is a list of conditions of which I said celiac disease, tropical sprue, Crohn's, and infection are the important ones. Then you can also have, hello, sorry, so there's audience. Sorry for that. Okay, yeah. So then we can have pancreatic disorders like chronic pancreatitis. You can have disorders in the stomach, and then you can have liver disorders like biliary obstruction, cirrhosis, etc. Okay. So these other conditions, which are the endocrine conditions, now these conditions actually do not cause malabsorption. They are mainly causes of secretory diarrhea. But sometimes, as a secondary manifestation, when a lot of fluid is lost, you can also lose some amount of nutrients. Okay. So essentially, these are the main etiological factors which are grouped depending on the site of involvement, most common being small intestine. Okay. So we'll also then look at what is the data from our country as to the different causes of malabsorption. We have published our own data from CMC as well. Okay. So these are the different studies from our country. All of them have been published in the last 10 years. This is data from West. We have data from Vellore. In North India, we have data from Lucknow and Delhi. And we also have data from Calcutta. So among all these studies which are looking at the spectrum of malabsorption as to what are the causes of malabsorption, if you see, the spectrum, the actual cause may vary from center to center, but still, as I told you, tropical sprue, celiac disease, tuberculosis, IBD, which is mainly Crohn's for malabsorption, and parasitic infection. These are the ones which account for most cases in all this series. Now, depending on which center, like for example, if it's North India and Delhi, in AIIMS New Delhi, most of the cases were celiac disease. In our center and in Mumbai and in Lucknow, tropical sprue was most common. So again, remember, while people may think that tropical sprue is not very common, it is still one of the important cause. This paper from Mumbai was published in 2016. So still it's very much there. And, you know, and I do see patients in OPD who are labeled as IBS diarrhea, and when you investigate, they turn out to be tropical sprue. So tropical sprue is very much there. We have to suspect to diagnose these cases, important cause of malabsorption. So apart from tropical sprue and celiac disease, we have tuberculosis, inflammatory bowel disease, which is an emerging and upcoming cause. We are seeing more and more cases of IBD, and it is emerging as an important cause of malabsorption. In fact, from the CMC data, about 15% of cases of malabsorption actually were IBD. And finally, in a tropical country like India, we should not forget parasitic infections, something which can be diagnosed on a simple stool test. Okay, and therefore, if you look at the different centers' experience, you look at the experience of Calcutta, 35% of patients actually among the 100 patients they had actually had parasitic infection. So always remember, parasitic infections are very important to test for in patients who are having diarrhea and malabsorption. Okay, so this was about the scenario from our country. So now we have discussed a little bit about the overview of process of digestion and absorption and what are the different conditions which can lead to malabsorption. Okay. Now next we'll discuss how do we approach a patient where we are suspecting malabsorption, and I have divided them into 3 steps. The first step is clinical evaluation, which is very important. So clinically, which means history, examination, to evaluate that the patient has features of malabsorption, and also to get a clue into what is the probable underlying cause of malabsorption. Then next is we investigate the patient. In investigation, we have to again establish that the patient has malabsorption and then identify etiology. Now, sometimes based on history and examination itself, you may have an idea that this patient has probably this particular etiology, in which case we can directly move on to the etiological investigation. So we don't have to do the test for malabsorption in all the patients, but this is good to know. This is how the flow is in patients in general. Okay? And once we have identified the etiology of malabsorption, the next step is treatment. And treatment obviously is directed at the underlying cause of malabsorption. But in addition, we also need to treat the nutrient deficiencies. Okay, so clinical evaluation, investigations, and management. So we'll discuss each of them one by one. Now, for clinical evaluation, as I said, we have 2 aims. To assess for features for malabsorption, and second is to look into the underlying etiology. So a good history and a thorough physical examination is essential. Okay, and this includes a good general examination as well as a proper nutritional assessment. Now, chronic diarrhea is often the most prominent symptoms in malabsorption, but please remember that every patient with malabsorption does not have diarrhea. In fact, especially in celiac disease in adults, they are known to have what is called as an atypical presentation, where many patients with celiac may not have diarrhea. So while diarrhea is an important symptom, every patient does not have to have diarrhea. In addition to diarrhea, patient may also have weight loss, fatigue, weakness. These are the typical features of patients with malabsorption. And then they will have features of specific nutrient deficiency, okay, which is something which we'll discuss in the next 2 slides. In children, they may have growth retardation. In women of reproductive age group, they may be amenorrhea. So again, chronic diarrhea with weight loss, fatigue and weakness, features of nutrient deficiency is what we have to look at. So it's always easy and good to divide the nutrients into major nutrients and micronutrients, both for clinical evaluation as well as for investigation. So clinical evaluation, the major nutrients, again, there are 3. We have carbohydrate, we have fat, and we have protein. So if the carbohydrate is not gas, etc., this is going to lead to bloating, flatulence, discomfort in abdomen. If fat absorption is not good, then there will be fat in the stool and the patient will have steatorrhea. There will be loss of subcutaneous fat on examination. If there is protein malabsorption, this will lead to the wasting of muscle. There will be low albumin, so patient will have edema, sometimes even ascites. So if you know the major nutrients, you'll be easily able to understand what are the features to ask for the major ones. For minor ones, this is something which all of us have been reading from our undergraduate days. It's nothing new, but it's important to think about them and ask about the features. Look for the history, look for the examination findings for looking at the deficiency of these micronutrients. So for iron, you may have pallor. When you examine the patient, there will be koilonychia. Vitamin A deficiency leads to night blindness. You may have white spot on examination, and skin examination may show follicular hyperkeratosis. Vitamin D and calcium deficiency, bone pain, fracture, muscle weakness, tetany, etc. Vitamin K deficiency will have an effect on the clotting and will lead to easy bruisability and petechiae. Vitamin C deficiency, again, you will have swelling of gum, poor wound healing, perifollicular hemorrhage, etc. Then you have a whole host of B vitamins, and this B vitamin complex deficiencies can cause glossitis, stomatitis, cheilitis. The classical 3Ds of niacin deficiency, which is diarrhea, dermatitis, and dementia, anemia, neuropathy, ataxia, etc. And essential fatty acid deficiency. So again, these are something all of us have been reading from undergraduate days, nothing new. But it's important to think about each of them and look for historical features as well as examination findings for these nutrients. So again, for clinical features of malabsorption, usually it's diarrhea, weight loss, fatigue. Features of specific nutrient deficiency, which is major nutrient and minor nutrient. Now, once you have done that assessment, we also have to look at the probable cause, because this may help us in minimizing the number of tests we are going to order for the patient. So therefore, this has a relevance to plan your investigation properly, that you look into the probable cause of malabsorption. And here again, if you remember the common conditions which I said, then you should ask history for those conditions. So for tuberculosis, it's basically patient may have fever, there may be ascites leading to abdominal distension, past history of tuberculosis or family history of tuberculosis. For celiac disease, the symptoms may be related to wheat or gluten in the diet. So the symptoms may improve when the patient avoids wheat products, and they may worsen with wheat product. They may have ulcers in the mouth. They may have skin manifestations like dermatitis or herpetiformis. Celiac also can have other disorders, like they may have thyroid problem or other issues as well. Inflammatory bowel disease, and they may have aphthous ulcers. They may have pain in the abdomen, and they have a host of extra-intestinal manifestations like joint pain, skin lesions, eye lesions, etc. So if you look for those in history and examination, you may get a clue to the underlying cause. For immunodeficiency and infection, again, history of high-risk behavior, past blood surgery, blood transfusion, IV drug abuse, recurrent infection, etc., will give you a clue to any underlying immunodeficiency or infection. If somebody has history of chronic alcohol intake, he has upper abdominal pain, which is worsened with food and relieved on sitting up and leaning forward, then you suspect a pancreatic disorder. So again, I think instead of trying to remember these, if you remember the conditions causing malabsorption, it will be easy to know what history to ask for each of the conditions. Okay, so again, if somebody had a surgery of the small bowel and bowel was resected, then this patient may be having bowel syndrome. So radiation, history of radiation, there may be a radiation-induced damage to the small intestine. And as I mentioned during the physiology of digestion, that it's very important and normal motility of GI tract for the process of digestion to go unhampered. And there are conditions which affect motility like diabetes mellitus, scleroderma. Somebody with diverticular, there may be pockets of intestine where there is stasis and bacteria can grow in that area. So here again, history of surgery which can cause stricture, history of diabetes, scleroderma, etc. are important. And finally, systemic conditions again, where diabetes, thyroid disorders again, and medication intake, something which we should not forget. And in last few years, we have now seen quite a few cases of patients with olmesartan. Olmesartan is an antihypertensive which is used quite frequently. And at least we have seen 3 to 4 cases of patients who have come with typical symptoms of malabsorption. They have villus atrophy on biopsy, and when you stop the medication, patient improves. So that's why I think a medication history, there are other medicines as well, which can lead to diarrhea and malabsorption. So we should take a good drug history. So far we have discussed about the etiology of malabsorption as to what are the conditions which can cause malabsorption. Next, we have discussed how do we clinically evaluate. So clinically, we look for features of malabsorption. We look for features of major nutrient deficiency, minor nutrient deficiency. And then we also need to, at the level of history and examination, look at any underlying cause like tuberculosis, celiac, IBD, infection, pancreatic disorders, systemic conditions, etc. So once you have done this part of your evaluation, the next step is moving on to the investigations. Okay. Now, investigations, again, there are two steps. You establish malabsorption, then you identify the underlying cause. Okay. So, establishing malabsorption, the tests are grouped into three. There are tests which are looking at the integrity of the mucosal surface and whether you are having adequate amount of surface area of small intestine. Then there are tests for major nutrients, like the same way we had clinical features, we have tests for major nutrients, and there are tests for micronutrients. Okay. So first we look at the tests for mucosal integrity. Now these tests, they do not look for digestion. They are only looking for absorption. For absorption, you need a healthy mucosal surface and you need an adequate mucosal surface area. So if the surface area is reduced or if there is a damage to mucosal surface, then these tests will be abnormal. Okay. And the test which we commonly do in clinical practice is the D-xylose absorption test. Now D-xylose is a pentose. It doesn't have to be digested any further. It just has to be absorbed. Okay. And it absorbed both by diffusion as well as transport. So this is a test which we frequently do. And as I told you, it just looks at the integrity of surface, doesn't look at digestion. So the xylose test which we do is can be done in both urine and blood. It can be done both in urine and in blood. Okay. Now in urine the urine is the one which we do very frequently because it's easier to do, doesn't involve any blood collection. But there are certain situations where we may have to do a blood xylose. So essentially what we're looking at is that we are giving the patient xylose, and if the absorptive surface area is good, then you will have xylose getting into the bloodstream and it will get. If there is a problem, then you won't have enough amount in the blood. So if it is a blood xylose, the level will be low in the blood. And if you do a urine xylose, the amount excreted in urine will be low. So for a urine xylose, we give 5 grams xylose after overnight fasting. And if less than 20% is excreted in 5-hour urine collection, then it is abnormal. Similarly, for blood xylose, if the level is less than 0.55 after 1 hour, it's abnormal. So when to do urine xylose, when to ask for blood xylose. Now, conditions where there is some problem in the renal function or there is a third space fluid collection, as happens in edema, ascites, effusion, etc., or in renal failure, then in those patients, the urine report is going to give you a false result. Also in children and pediatric patients where the urine collection, the compliance may not be very good. So in pediatrics also, again, for those patients, we often do a blood xylose. For other patients, we can do urine xylose. So this is the test which we do most often for mucosal integrity. Okay. And of late, there has been a lot of interest in this marker called citrulline. Now, citrulline is the amino acid which is produced by the small intestine. So if you have a healthy intestine and if there is an adequate amount of surface area, then citrulline levels are good. When there is a disease of small intestine, if the surface area is reduced, the citrulline level becomes low. This is emerging as a promising marker. As of now, it's not used much in clinical practice, but maybe in future we'll have one more option apart from xylose, because xylose again involves somebody to take the powder, then give urine sample for 5 hours. This just involves a blood sample collection. So maybe in future, this test may become one of the tests for looking at the mucosal surface integrity. So that was about the test for mucosal surface integrity, where xylose is the one which we normally check. Then moving on to the major nutrients, the one which we often check again is stool fat. Now stool fat, the gold standard is the stool 72-hour fat collection. Okay. Now in this 72-hour fat collection, we give the patient 100 grams of fat per day and stool is collected for 72 hours. Okay. Normally, the amount of fat excreted should be less than 7 grams per day. If somebody has diarrhea, up to 14 grams may be considered normal. So often patients with malabsorption are also having diarrhea. So therefore, for patients with malabsorption with diarrhea, if the stool fat is more than 14 grams per day, then it is considered abnormal. Now, while this test is very good, the problem with this test is that the technicians are not very happy handling so much of stool. There is a lot of resistance at their level to do such tests. In fact, right now in our country, maybe there's only 2 centers. Our center in CMC and one more center, probably Lucknow, which does this test. The rest of them have done away because of the difficulty in getting technicians to do this test. And also there are now other semi-quantitative and qualitative tests available. Like we can have, there's the fat globule test, something which we do in CMC as well. And there are other tests. But again, the gold standard, the most accurate one is the stool fat. And then a semi-quantitative or qualitative test, what we use is the fat globule. Then there are other tests like NIRA, which is near infrared reflectance analysis. These are actually quite simple, and it checks for all fat. It checks for everything: the fat, protein, carbohydrate, and water as well. But these are very expensive equipments. They are mainly available as a research tool, not available generally for clinical practice. Okay. So essentially, what we have right now for fat malabsorption is we have the 72-hour fat, and we have the stool fat globules, which we do for our patients. Okay. The other major nutrients are carbohydrate and protein. For carbohydrate, again, these two things we generally don't check in clinical practice. But carbohydrate, there will be a stool pH will be low. Now, there are specific tests, like if somebody has a lactose intolerance, there's a lactase deficiency, you can do a hydrogen breath test. But again, not done much. We don't do it for our patients generally. For protein also, we don't check directly for malabsorption, but something like albumin, although albumin is very non-specific, there are multiple reasons for low albumin. It can also give you an idea about a low protein. Patients who are losing protein in the intestine, like what we call as a protein losing enteropathy, we can do a GI protein scintigraphy. But these again are tests reserved really towards the end. If we haven't found any cause, these are not done in the initial part of evaluation. So essentially for major nutrients, which are fat, carbohydrate, and protein, what we normally check for is the fat. Okay. Moving on to the micronutrients. Now these are really simple blood tests which you just send to the lab, and therefore these are commonly done. They should be done in all the patients where we suspect malabsorption. So this includes iron, hemoglobin, ferritin, calcium, magnesium, phosphate, the vitamin D, B12, and prothrombin time, which reflects vitamin K function. Okay. So these tests are very easy to order, and they should be done in all patients where you suspect malabsorption. So just to summarize the tests for malabsorption, we have, as I told you, the tests for mucosal surface integrity, which is a urine xylose, which we do in clinical practice. Test for major nutrient, which is carbohydrate, fat, and protein. What we do is the fat, 72-hour fat or a fat globule. If on clinical history and evaluation, if you have a clue as to what the underlying etiology is, the mucosal integrity and the major nutrient can be skipped. So we don't have to do these two tests in patient. Okay. Whereas micronutrients are very easy to do, and they also have a bearing in therapy. So if somebody has a particular nutrient deficiency, you have to treat that. So because treatment for the micronutrients is quite specific, micronutrients are checked in every patient, irrespective of whatever condition they have. Whereas the tests like xylose and fat, we can skip if we know what the underlying cause is based on our history and examination. Okay. So that was the first part of investigation where we have established malabsorption. The second part, as I said, is establishing etiology, because that's when you'll be able to treat specifically the underlying condition. Now, in terms of establishing etiology, again, the tests are grouped into different types. We have the stool test, the blood test, endoscopy and biopsy, the radiology, and you have the other tests. Actually. Now, again, in a tropical country like India, please do not forget stool tests, because there are a significant proportion of patients who have parasitic infection as a cause of malabsorption, as I showed you in the earlier slide. So among the blood and stool tests, I told you we have to look for stool ova and parasites, and it needs both routine as well as special stains. So please ask for stool all the parasitic infections. And stool can also be checked for calprotectin, which is a marker of inflammation. And blood tests can be done for CRP, ESR. CRP will be elevated if your patient is having IBD. Celiac serology for celiac disease. HIV serology and immunoglobulins for immunodeficiency conditions. Thyroid function test, blood sugar for systemic disorders. Liver function test, blood count. Stool elastase for pancreatic insufficiency. Now, among these tests, except for the parasite, other tests will probably give you a clue, but they may not confirm the diagnosis. So these may give you an indicator that, okay, if somebody is high CRP, maybe he's got IBD. If somebody is a celiac serology positive, it's probably celiac disease. So once you have these things, they may help guiding your next investigation. Okay, so they may not always be sufficient tests, but these are the initial tests which we do. In some cases, like parasite, they may be diagnostic. In others, they help us to decide what should be the next test done. So stool examination, inflammatory markers, serology for celiac disease, HIV serology, thyroid function test, blood sugar, etc. And again, simple radiological tests like chest X-ray can give you a clue about previous or a current tuberculosis. Ultrasound, although a simple test, can give you a lot of information like presence of omental thickening, ascites, lymphadenopathy, chronic pancreatitis, etc. Okay. So once you have done these basic stool and blood tests and basic radiological tests, in some patients you may have a diagnosis, but in most patients you may have to go to the next step. And the next most important step is endoscopy with biopsy, which generally is upper GI endoscopy with duodenal biopsy. This is the test which we do most often in our cases with malabsorption syndrome. So you do an endoscopy and you take biopsy from the duodenal mucosa. And what we are looking for in the biopsy is features like villus atrophy and others. The features commonly seen is villus atrophy, but duodenal villus atrophy is something which can be seen in celiac disease, in tropical sprue, even in IBD, and other conditions. So villus atrophy is not a very specific finding. Okay? So while it tells you the patient has malabsorption, villus atrophy has to be interpreted in terms of other reports. So if you have a villus atrophy and positive TTG, then you suspect it's probably celiac disease. Okay, but this is the usual feature we look for on endoscopy and biopsy. Now, sometimes biopsy may show specific feature which is straight away diagnostic, like parasitic infection, which you detect in stool, can also be seen on biopsy specimen. We have seen strongyloids and giardia being picked up on biopsy specimen. Okay, then you can have this specific features in conditions like amyloidosis, eosinophilic gastroenteritis, Whipple's disease, lymphangiectasia, A beta lipoproteinemia. But remember, these are quite rare conditions. You don't see them very frequently. But if you do see findings, then the features may be diagnostic. So the feature which we are generally looking for on upper GI endoscopy and biopsy is basically villus atrophy. Now, the normal endoscope cannot tell us about the villus morphology, but now we have technology available with us, which actually in the real time during endoscopy itself can tell us that whether the patient has villus atrophy. And one such technology is this magnification narrowband imaging. This is something which we have at our center and we have published our data as well. So if you look at this picture of duodenum here using the image enhancement, you see you can straight away appreciate this finger-like villi. So this is image taken during endoscopy. Okay, now just compare it with just think of the white light images normally which you get, where the mucosa appears as a flat surface. Okay. So in this case, we can straight away look at the villi. This is a patient without any abnormality. Now look at this picture. This also is an image obtained by the same imaging modality. And here you can't see any of this finger-like. So this patient has severe villus atrophy. Okay. So while this technology is good for detecting villus atrophy, it is not a substitute for biopsy. So please remember, biopsy is still very much required. Biopsy gives you a lot of other information which this technology cannot give you. But then you'll ask, why should we do this test if it doesn't give us any added information? So sometimes what happens is, especially in celiac disease, the atrophy can be patchy. So like, for example, say this is a patient's celiac disease. He may have atrophy in this area, but he may not have atrophy in this area. And so if you have something, a technology like a narrowband imaging, then you can find out which area is atrophy and you can target that area for biopsy. So the main strength of this is that you can take targeted biopsy. So again, this is something somebody has already been worked up for malabsorption. The cause is not very clear. We can make use of this technology. Okay. Fine. So far in terms of etiology, we said stool test, blood test, simple radiology, upper GI endoscopy, and duodenal biopsy. So by this time, about 50 to 60% of the cases will get diagnosed actually. Okay. So therefore, at that stage, you can stop and proceed to treatment. But if you remember the etiology, I said other important conditions like tuberculosis and IBD also lead to malabsorption. And tuberculosis and IBD often affect the small and large intestine. And therefore, if at the end of upper GI endoscopy and biopsy, if the diagnosis is not clear, then we have to move to small bowel and large bowel evaluation. Okay, of which the test we often do first is colonoscopy and biopsy, because ileocecal area is the most common site both for Crohn's as well as for tuberculosis. Okay, so next we go to the colonoscopy, and so this is a picture of ileocecal valve with ulcerations. When you see this finding, you suspect tuberculosis, you suspect Crohn's disease. So these patients, we do colonoscopy, we take biopsies, and we also send biopsy for microbiology. So please remember, it's not only histopathology, but you also have to send for microbiology, for TB, for culture, as well as the molecular test. Okay. And if even at colonoscopy, if our diagnosis is not clear, or if the diagnosis is Crohn's, where you need to know how much of small bowel is also involved, then you have to proceed to small bowel assessment. So it's a systematic approach. First upper GI endoscopy, then colonoscopy with biopsy, and then as required, we move on to the small bowel evaluation. A small bowel is actually a large structure. A normal endoscope cannot go and examine the entire small bowel. And therefore, it's not very easy to examine the small bowel with endoscopy directly. So when it comes to small bowel evaluation, we rely mainly on the radiological tests. Okay. Now, among the radiological tests, the one we often order is CT enterography and MR enterography. One of the two is sufficient. Okay. Now, please remember it's CT enterography. It is not same as CCT abdomen. So sometimes you see patients with malabsorption, they've had a CCT abdomen, but that doesn't involve a enterography protocol. If you're suspecting a small bowel disorder, if you're evaluating a malabsorption, then you have to specifically ask for enterography. Okay, whether it's a CT enterography, MR, any will do. And CT, the benefit is it not only tells you about the bowel, it also tells you about what is happening outside the bowel, like lymph node, omentum, etc., the vascular thing, pancreas. Okay, so it can give you a lot of information. In past, we used to do, in fact, when I was a resident, the test we used to do frequently was a barium meal, but barium meal is now seldom used because it only gives you information about the inside the lumen in the bowel wall, whereas CT gives you much more information. So now barium has hardly any role, and most often we go for a CT enterography or MR enterography. So this is a picture of a CT enterography, and as you can see, there is a stricture in the small intestine with thickening of bowel wall. Okay? So this can help you in diagnosing. Now the problem is this test sufficient to diagnose all the cases? The answer is no, because this pattern may be seen in tuberculosis, you may see it in Crohn's disease, sometimes even in lymphoma. So the radiological features, while in some cases may be classical, like if you see a necrotic lymph node, if you see omental thickening, ascites, you know probably it's tuberculosis. If you see multiple segment involvement, if you see mesenteric vessel engorgement, then those features may point towards Crohn's disease. But then there are quite a few patients where the appearance of CT is not very diagnostic. So while we know there is a pathology in the small intestine, we still don't know what pathology it is. You have to make your mind whether it's tuberculosis or Crohn's disease or whatever, because therapy will depend on what the underlying condition is. And therefore, we have to again go for a tissue diagnosis. So olden days, our option was to go for a laparoscopy and laparotomy, but now we have endoscopes for small intestine. Okay. Now these endoscopes, the problem is they may not be able to traverse the entire small intestine. So they may be able to go up to 2 to 3 meters max actually. Okay. So that's why these are used as a second step. So supposing on a CT, the lesion is closer to the ileocecal valve, you go through the colonic route, what we call as a retrograde enteroscopy. If the lesion is near the BJ flexure, we go through the anterograde. So enteroscopy's role is that once you have picked up a lesion on CT and you want to take a tissue diagnosis, then you go with the enteroscopy. And depending on which part of GI tract involved, you can go antegrade or you can go retrograde. We also have the capsule endoscopy, but the problem with capsule is that it cannot biopsy. And if there is a stricturing lesion like you saw in this particular patient, then capsule will get stuck. So capsule doesn't have too much of role in such patients. So here balloon enteroscopy is what is helpful. And we have the single balloon enteroscope, we have double balloon enteroscope, and the newer one called Spirus. So this is a picture of jejunum with an enteroscope. This is a patient having a stricture, so you can take biopsy. Okay. Fine. So that was about the investigation. So investigation, I said two parts. You establish malabsorption, and then you identify etiology. For etiology, you have the stool test, blood test, simple radiological test, then endoscopy with biopsy. If diagnosis is not clear, you go to the colonoscopy. If still not clear, you have to go for small bowel imaging. Small bowel imaging can be radiology. And then if you need a tissue diagnosis, you have to go for enteroscopy. Once you have identified an etiology, the next step is treatment. Treatment is two-part. You have to treat the underlying condition as well as the specific nutrient deficiencies which the patient has. So nutrient deficiency, I'm not going to discuss. Even underlying cause, I'll discuss few important conditions. So of which one condition we should talk about is tropical sprue, because this is one condition where a lot of work has been done from CMC by Dr. Mathan and Dr. Baker, and CMC has contributed lots to the knowledge of tropical sprue. Tropical sprue is a condition, basically, it's a condition of unknown etiology. Okay, we don't know what causes tropical sprue. It's supposed to be an infective etiology. Earlier, it used to be in two forms, the epidemic form and the sporadic form. The epidemic form is not seen anymore, but we still see the sporadic form, as I was mentioning in the spectrum of malabsorption. Okay. So the symptoms are very typical of a chronic malabsorptive diarrhea. Patient has diarrhea, pale, bulky stool, bloating, and weight loss, and patient has deficiency of nutrients. Okay. Now, the important thing in tropical sprue is that there is no diagnostic feature, no specific diagnostic feature. So you have to exclude other causes of malabsorption like stool infection, celiac disease, immunodeficiency, IBD, all of them have to be excluded before you can diagnose somebody as tropical sprue. And biopsy and endoscopy and biopsy often shows villus atrophy, but villus atrophy, as I told you, is a non-specific feature also seen in celiac disease. But if you see villus atrophy in a patient, if the patient has malabsorption of two unrelated nutrients, so what we check is for vitamin B12, xylose, and fat. And out of these three, if two are abnormal, and if other causes are excluded, then that patient most likely has tropical sprue, and most of them will also have villus atrophy. Okay, the treatment is with antibiotic like doxycycline along with B12 and folate for 3 to 6 months. The next condition is celiac disease. Celiac disease, also known as gluten-sensitive enteropathy, because patients are sensitive to gluten in diet. Okay, so therefore it is mainly seen in the wheat-eating population, and so it's not very common in South India. But again, many of our patients come from North and Northeast, so we have to be aware about this condition. The diagnosis is mainly based on a positive TTG along with the biopsy. Biopsy will show raised intraepithelial lymphocytes, there will be villus atrophy and crypt hypoplasia. Most of these patients also have this HLA DQ28, which is supposed to be the predisposing HLA for celiac disease. Apart from GI manifestations, they may also have extra GI manifestations like thyroid disorders, diabetes, skin manifestation like dermatitis herpetiformis. They may also have liver enzyme abnormality. So about celiac disease, I just want to mention about this important study. This is the largest study so far in terms of prevalence of celiac disease from our country. And this was led by Dr. Ramakrishna, who was a professor and former head of our gastroenterology department in CMC. So this was a multi-center population-based study from which had Vellore, Delhi, and a center from Assam. And they looked at more than 23,000 patients, okay, in the community. And what they found was that the prevalence of celiac disease in the North India was 1.2%. In Northeast, it was 0.8%. It was only 0.1%. This is, mind you, a population. It's not a hospital-based study. So that's why it's 0.1% in our part of the country. Okay. But an interesting observation in the study was that when they looked at the HLA DQ28, this is the HLA which predisposes. So most patients with celiac will have HLA DQ2 or 8 actually. So when they looked at the HLA DQ2 and 8, it was present in 38% in North India, 31% in Northeast, and 36% in South India. So what it tells us is that even in South India, HLA DQ8 is almost same frequency as it is. It's essentially the dietary pattern which is protecting the people in South India from celiac disease. Another important point to remember about celiac disease is about TTG. Now, often when TTG is positive, we jump to the diagnosis it is celiac disease. But please remember, TTG can be false positive in other conditions as well, especially in a tropical country like India, where you have so many conditions causing malabsorption. See, in the West, they have mainly celiac disease. But in our country, we have a lot of other conditions. When we looked at our own data from CMC, what we found is that TTG can be positive in other conditions as well. And therefore, to call somebody a celiac disease, you need to have a biopsy and the features on biopsy before you call celiac. And also, you should follow up the patient after the patient is getting a gluten-free diet. Okay. In terms of management, it is nicely summarized by the acronym CELIAC. So C stands for consultation with skilled dietitian. E is for education about the disease. L, which is the cornerstone of therapy, is lifelong adherence to gluten-free diet. This is the main aspect of therapy, that the patient has to be on a gluten-free diet lifelong. Okay. I is for identification and treatment of other nutritional deficiencies. A is access to advocacy groups, and C stands for follow-up. So basically, these are the main steps of therapy in a celiac disease patient. Moving on to tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, as I told you, is one of the important causes of malabsorption. And malabsorption mainly happens in small intestinal and ileocecal tuberculosis. And there are multiple mechanisms like overgrowth of bacteria because of stricture, reduced absorptive surface area because of ulcerations, involvement of lymphatics, etc. So in terms of treatment, again, what is the treatment? Before that, also remember that TB can sometimes be difficult to differentiate from Crohn's disease. That's one thing which we dilemma which we keep facing in clinical practice. In terms of therapy, there's always a debate about how much therapy to give, whether it should be a 6-month or a 9-month. So again, there is a multi-center study from our country, of which CMC Vellore is also a part of the study. CMC Vellore, AIIMS New Delhi, and Lucknow. And they have looked at close to 200 patients in this randomized sort of study. And what they found was that the 6-month therapy was as effective as 9-month therapy. And this was a DOTS, just like thrice weekly therapy. Okay. So therefore, for our patients with TB, we give them 6 months of ATT. In terms of IBD, again, IBD is what I told you is an emerging cause of chronic diarrhea and malabsorption. We are seeing more and more cases of IBD now in our practice. There are multiple reasons for malabsorption, including loss of bowel length because of surgery, because of ulceration. And they may have strictures, which may promote overgrowth of bacteria. There may be abnormality even at a microscopic level. There will be abnormality at, there will be abnormal tight junctions, lipid imbalance, etc. And finally, because of ileal disease, there will be problems with bile absorption as well as B12. So therefore, these patients, the mechanism of malabsorption is multiple. Now, I'm not going to discuss about the management of IBD because there is a whole lecture lined up later in this series on management of IBD by AJ. The last one we'll discuss is parasites. Again, we will discuss the specific theory for each parasitic infection. But just to let you know what are the common parasites which we see. And once you know the parasitic infection, then you can treat accordingly. So the common parasites seen in the Indian series are Giardia, strongyloids, HIV-related parasites like Cryptosporidium, Microsporidium, etc. Okay. So here you have to treat the parasitic infection as well as if the patient has associated immune deficiency like hypogammaglobulinemia or HIV, they also have to be treated. So treat the specific parasitic infection and treat any immunodeficiency condition if the patient has any condition. Okay. This again is a paper published from our center showing some of the parasites. So you can see Cryptosporidium in this picture, Isospora. This is a picture showing Microsporidium and strongyloids. So the common conditions causing malabsorption. Okay, so this is the last slide of my presentation. Okay, just to summarize what I have discussed today, this is a lecture basically to give you an idea about how do you, so this is a very big topic. So I've just given an idea about how do you approach a patient who comes to you with malabsorption. So it always begins with a good clinical evaluation, which means history, examination, including general examination, nutritional assessment, etc. Patients often come with diarrhea, weight loss, nutrient deficiency. Diarrhea is not always present, but diarrhea is a prominent feature. Also look for coexisting illnesses, use of drugs, etc. Okay. And after the clinical evaluation, move on to investigation, which includes testing for malabsorption as well as nutritional status. So you can test. So the test we do is usually urine xylose, stool fat, and then for nutrients like B12, iron, etc. Then you look for the specific etiology by doing stool tests, chest X-ray, other blood tests, okay, serology, endoscopy with biopsy. And by this stage, a lot of patients, you will have the diagnosis. If diagnosis is not clear, then you have to move on to evaluation of small and large bowel, which will be in the form of colonoscopy with biopsy, small bowel imaging. Now, again, there are many other conditions causing malabsorption. I haven't covered all of them in this lecture. If things are not clear, then there are so many other tests which we can do to reach a diagnosis and treat those patients. Okay? So thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, sir. That was a very clear and broad overview on our approach to malabsorption. If any questions, please feel free to put up in the chat box. I think there's one in the chat box right now. So there's a question. So what is the utility of fecal calprotectin? In what situations should we test for it?
That's a good question. Basically, fecal calprotectin is an inflammatory marker, and fecal calprotectin gives you an idea if the patient has IBD. So there are two scenarios of using calprotectin. One is in malabsorptive setting, one is non-malabsorptive setting. It's essentially a patient who comes to us with diarrhea. Now, often when you have diarrhea, you have to do a colonoscopy, but diarrhea can happen in IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome, and diarrhea can be inflammatory bowel disease. So what has been shown is that if you do a calprotectin in a younger patient and if the calprotectin is negative, then the patient is unlikely to have an IBD. So you can avoid doing a colonoscopy when you're suspecting an IBS versus an IBD. But if the patient has features of malabsorption like weight loss, alarm features like say blood in stool, then those cases you don't need. If there's no blood in stool and diarrhea, then calprotectin can give you a hint towards underlying etiology. Okay. So one is to differentiate IBS from IBD. That is patients with just diarrhea but no other features of malabsorption. Second is in malabsorption when there is no blood in stool. In those patients, if there's no blood, there is chronic diarrhea, and if calprotectin is high, then one of the likely cause in that patient may be IBD, and you may have to go for a small bowel or colonic evaluation in that patient. So I think the next question is, do patients with all chronic diarrhea but no weight loss require testing for celiac disease? Now, again, this is an interesting question. Now, if you ask me, in my practice, if somebody comes from North and Northeast, I do ask for celiac serology because sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish the two, and there may be a bit of a latency between the onset of symptoms and this thing. But again, for South Indian patients, you don't have to do it. North Indian patients, if somebody has, say, a persistent symptoms, because often patients who come to us are not the first time visitors. They would have gone to doctors in other places as well. So therefore, it really depends on what clinical scenario the patient is. If somebody is coming first time, you may not have to. If somebody is from North and Northeast and somebody has previous, say, symptomatic therapy, not much response, you should look for a celiac serology in those patients.
Okay, we'll catch up later.
Thank you, sir. Any further questions? So what about doing an examination for blood and stool, the different modalities and aspects to it?
Generally, you're asking generally blood and stool test, or is it any specific condition? You want to know the blood test in general or for any? So generally, we do the CBC and LFT. But as I told you, the blood test includes a celiac serology. It includes HIV serology. We look for CRP, which is inflammatory marker. Yeah.
Okay. So there's one more question. How do we clinically differentiate between pancreatic and intestinal cause?
Okay. So that's again a very interesting and good question. Now, pancreatic condition, the main defect is in fat absorption in those patients actually. Okay. So they will typically have steatorrhea. Steatorrhea is basically oil droplets in stool sticking to pan actually. Okay. And then also patient will have some history of pancreatic disorder like chronic ethanol intake or upper abdominal pain with, which is worsened with food and all that. So there's a clinical indicator, and historically you'll have history of oil in the stool actually. But having said that, it's not present in all the patients. And also patients who are having mucosal disorder like celiac disease and tropical sprue may also have fat malabsorption, but it may not be up to the same extent as in the pancreatitis. So finally, in clinical practice, what we depend on is the patient will have had an ultrasound which will show a calcific pancreatitis or something, and you will do a TTG anyway in those patients is what I feel. Okay. But clinically, the steatorrhea is the prominent symptom, and history of any pancreatic disorder and chronic ethanol intake will give you a clue towards pancreas. But remember, tropical sprue, celiac disease also can cause steatorrhea, but they'll also have other nutrient malabsorption, which may not be very prominent only with pancreatic. Pancreatic is mainly fat, whereas celiac and tropical sprue will be a global malabsorption. Fat, others, everything, the micronutrients also will be deficient. Whereas in pancreas, it will be fat and the fat-related nutrients.
Thank you, sir. Any further questions? Anyone who missed out on this lecture, please be conveyed that this lecture will soon be uploaded on our Department of Medicine YouTube website. If you even if further doubts, also if you want to mail it to sir, please feel free to mail to med2@cmcvellore.ac.in, which will be forwarded to Dr. Amit sir. Any further questions?
Can hear some noise in the background.
So I think we'll wind up for today.
Yeah, yes.
Thanks again, sir, for taking this lecture for us. We are really grateful to have you here. Hopefully, we'll be having further sessions also with the gastro in terms of approaches to symptoms, in terms of jaundice and other things. So I think we'll get back again with further lectures. Thanks again, sir.
Thank you. Thank you all for
listening. We'll wind up for today.
Thank you.